Hello, I'm Dorothy Callahan, Manager, Government Markets and VIP Development and Strategic Relationships of the Veteran Institute for Procurement. I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. I would like to welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, SBA's final rule on joint ventures, the Mentor-Protégé program, the 8A program, and much more. Today's webinar was developed to help veteran businesses accelerate growth in the federal marketplace. And that is what VIP is all about, accelerating the success of veteran-owned small business government contractors. And it's working. On average, companies grow 63% 1 year after graduation from the VIP program. And VIP Grow graduates report a 357% growth for just 2 years after graduation. VIP offers 4 different curriculums to give veteran-owned small businesses the tools they need to win government contract. Programs are held in Washington, D.C., just 11 miles from the White House. However, due to the coronavirus pandemic, we have temporarily switched to a virtual program. Participants receive hands-on, market-based instruction that helps establish best practices for federal government contracting. And the program is offered at no cost. We currently offer VIP Start for veteran-owned small businesses looking to become procurement ready, VIP Grow for later stage companies already selling to the federal government and looking to scale, VIP International, which accelerates veteran small business success in the global marketplace, VIP Aerospace, which accelerates veteran small business success in the federal aerospace market. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Veteran Institute for Procurement in partnerships with SBA and the Veterans Business Outreach, VBOC. The slides and audios from today's webinar will be made available on the VIP website at www.nationalvip.org, as well as emailed to you following the webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Peter Ford and Anna Wright. Peter Ford is a partner at PilieroMazza, where he advises government contracts and commercial businesses on a broad range of federal procurement matters. He is adept at navigating issues related to eligibility for and continued participation in small business programs such as SBA's 8A business development, this SDVOSB, women-owned and hub zone programs, and the VA's VetBiz VIP program. He also counsels federal contractors on FAR and small business regulation compliance, which includes auditing clients for potential size and affiliation issues. Anna Wright is an associate at PilieroMazza, where she assists clients in a variety of government contracting matters. Anna guides commercial businesses through bid protests at all levels, size, and status protests, requests for equitable adjustment, claims, and appeals. Her work encompasses small business procurement matters, particularly on issues related to eligibility, participation in the federal small business set-aside programs, and maintaining regulatory compliance. Anna also works closely with PilieroMazza's False Claims Act group and addresses other issues arising under the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the Contract Disputes Act. Anna and Peter will save some time at the end of their presentation for Q&A. So please submit your questions in the chat box, in the questions box. And now it is my pleasure to turn today's webinar over to our panelists.
Thanks, Dorothy, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Like Dorothy said, my name is Peter Ford. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza. With me today is Anna Wright, who's an associate and a colleague of mine. PilieroMazza is a business law firm dedicated to servicing the needs of government contractors and commercial businesses. We have a labor and employment practice, a corporate practice, litigation practice, but what we're most well known for is our government contracting practice. And then within government contracting, we really have a strong focus on small business. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. These mentor-protégé amendments and some of these other government contracting amendments, which frankly are very important, as you'll see, all really pertain to small business government contracting and how you can, for example, make the most use out of your, your status, your SDV/OSB status, your 8A status, what have you. How you can leverage that status to be a more competitive government contractor. So just a little history on this rule. The proposed rule, I believe, was issued in November of 2009. SBA received roughly 190 comments, including comments that we submitted. Then the final rule was issued on November 16th, and it was effective, October 16th, effective November 16th. And so that's basically what we're going to be talking today, are really the highlights from the final rule. So Anna's going to touch on some of the mentor-protégé changes. Then we'll discuss some of the changes they made to the joint venture regulations, small business rules generally, and then changes that are specific to the SBA's 8A program. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So this rule that Peter mentioned that we're talking about today, one of the big things that the rule changed was merging the 8A Mentor-Protégé program into the all small Mentor-Protégé program. So now, instead of having two different Mentor-Protégé programs, we just have the one. This means that 8A Mentor-Protégé agreements have to transition to the all small program. And it also comes as a few general program changes just to make sure that everyone is working with the same sort of rule book. The rule also eliminates the reconsideration process for any declined mentor-protégé agreements. So that means that if you submit an MPA, a mentor-protégé agreement, to SBA, and SBA declines your mentor-protégé agreement, there isn't a process for you to appeal that that action. You have to instead just start over. And also it adds some parameters regarding mentor eligibility. The mentor entity must demonstrate both commitment and ability to assist small business concerns. It's not enough to just want to help, you have to be able to help if you are a mentor. It also finally includes provisions giving certain benefits to mentors with protégés whose principal place of business is in Puerto Rico. So normally mentors can only have 3 protégés at one time, but if they have 2 protégés from whose principal place of business is in Puerto Rico, they can have up to 5 protégés. So with 2 or more of them being from Puerto Rico and the remainder being not from Puerto Rico.
Yeah, just really quickly, a little history as to why they consolidated the mentor-protégé programs. When SBA was implementing the all small mentor-protégé program, it was designed based off of the 8A program because Congress told SBA it has to look and talk and walk like the 8A program. So essentially we had SBA had 2 mentor-protégé programs out there that were essentially identical. One was limited to 8A firms. The other was open to all firms, including 8A firms. And they both had the same benefits, the same mentor, the same eligibility requirements. So the idea was, why have 2? Let's just consolidate and have 1. And so that's what they've done.
Right. So next, the new-ish rule, doesn't count mentor-protégé relationships terminated within 18 months of SBA's approval of that mentor-protégé agreement against the protégé firm's 2 mentor lifetime limit. So as a lot of you probably know, typically a protégé can only have a total of 2 mentors throughout the protégé's business lifetime. But if a protégé, or if the parties for whatever reason decide to terminate that agreement within 18 months, or if the protégé feels that the mentor isn't giving adequate support, the relationship can be terminated. If that happens within those 18 months, then it doesn't, that short relationship doesn't count toward that 2 mentor lifetime limit. However, if a protege shows a consistent pattern of terminating these agreements within the first 18 months, SBA might refuse to approve further applications. So it's within SBA's discretion, but if someone is clearly gaming the system by just running through mentor after mentor after mentor and not following through with longer term agreements, then SBA can terminate or can refuse to approve additional agreements.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this change is if you look at the regulation, it doesn't say anything. I mean, the whole rationale is if you're not getting the benefits that the mentor agreed to provide pursuant to the mentor-protege agreement, and you're not getting any assistance, so to speak, then you can get out of that relationship within the first 18 months. But if you look at the regulation, it doesn't really say anything about having to demonstrate a lack of assistance. But in practice, and this is something that just happened this week, we had a client who submitted a notice to SBA to terminate the agreement, give them a little information behind why they wanted to terminate it. And then SBA came back and said, hey, we went back and looked at your recent annual review for the mentor-protege, and we think you benefited. And because you've got some benefits out of this relationship, we're refusing to annul it. So I'm not sure if that's going to be how it works in practice moving forward, or if there's going to be some clarification, because I think the idea was, yeah, we don't want people circumventing the regs by just terminating relationship to get more and more relationships. But I think that they resolved that by doing what Anna discussed about if there's a pattern of termination. But there's nothing that says, if you want to terminate the first one, for example, there's a standard of proof that you have to show to the SBA in terms of assistance that you didn't get.
Right. So touching on, or springing off the annual assessments that Peter just noted, proteges are required to provide honest assessments of their mentor's performance to SBA during each of those annual reviews. So the goal of that is for SBA to be able to assess whether the mentor is providing good support to the protege. And sort of as a corollary to that, proteges can request SBA intervention if the mentor is underperforming. That also kind of goes back to the whole terminate within 18 months piece. These all tie together, although they can happen independently, because if 2 years have gone by and after your second, a little bit into your second year, you realize the mentor isn't really helping you, and then you state that at your 2-year review, then SBA can step in and terminate the agreement or replace the mentor if the mentor just doesn't correct whatever it's doing wrong. So the rule also provides that SBA can approve a mentor-protege relationship under concern's secondary NAICS code. The SBA has been able to do this since the existence of the All Small Mentor-Protege program. But the rules weren't necessarily super clear about how that could work. So this final rule clarifies that a protege doesn't necessarily need to be small under its primary NAICS code to have a mentor-protege relationship under its secondary NAICS code. Now, the prospective protege can enter into one of these secondary NAICS code mentor-protege relationships if the business can demonstrate that it's performed work in one or more similar NAICS codes, or where the NAICS code in which the small business concern seeks a mentor-protege relationship is a logical business progression to work previously performed by the concern. But SBA will not approve a mentor-protege relationship in a secondary NAICS code where the small business doesn't have any prior experience. Now, that's to make sure that small businesses aren't, again, just kind of gaming the system, and making sure that mentor-protege relationships are actually helpful. It's not just a large business essentially using a small business as an arm via this mentor-protege relationship, and also just making sure that the small business, is receiving benefit and is active in the industry if they want to have this relationship in.
Anna, this is
Yes.
Dorothy, but I did want to, we were getting a lot of questions, which is great, but I wanted to let the folks that are listening that questions, please make sure you do put your question in, and we will ask those questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you very much.
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you for the questions.
Sorry.
No problem. All right, and now Peter.
So
Chat
moving on
with
to
you about
joint ventures. So one of the biggest joint venture related changes that came out of the final rule was a change to what was previously called the 3 and 2 rule. So previously, well, by definition, a joint venture is a limited purpose entity. Previously, it was limited both in terms of time and in terms of number of contract awards. And the rule essentially said that a joint venture could get 3 contracts over a 2-year period starting from the date of the first contract award. So you were limited to 3 contracts. And if you got a 4th or otherwise violated the 3 and 2 rule, you would be found to be generally affiliated. So SBA got a lot of comments in response to that, what they're proposing, which is to make it a little more relaxed so that people don't necessarily have to just form a joint venture, because you can. I mean, you can max out a joint venture, and you used to be able to max out a joint venture and then just go form another joint venture with the same joint venture partner and just do that time and time over again. But what they've done now is they've gotten rid of the 3 contract limit. And so now the only limitation is the 2-year period. So what that means is once you get your first contract award, once the JV gets its first contract award, that's when the 2-year clock, so to speak, starts. And you can get as many contracts as you want during that 2-year period. Another welcome change is the SBA is no longer going to approve joint ventures for 8A competitive procurements. I mean, previously, 8A had to approve your joint venture agreement prior to award of the contract. And frankly, it was a rather cumbersome process in terms of the number of documents you had to get to the SBA and making sure that SBA was staying on top of everything and reviewing everything so that when the award decision came, they had blessed everything. So it was a lot of work for the SBA. It was a lot of work for the 8A firm and their joint venture partner. So now that approval process has gone away. And I guess it's not entirely clear, but I imagine at some point SAM's going to be updated so that an 8A joint venture can go into SAM and just self-certify as such. The caveat is if it's a sole source award, you still have to get SBA's approval. More on the 3 and 2 rule. So they just clarified this, and I think this was already a policy previously to the clarification, but if you get, because when we're talking about the 3 and 2 rule, it includes because the idea is, what's a contract and what's not? Well, the regulations say it's a prime contract, a novated prime contract, or a subcontract in which the joint venture is acting as a similarly situated entity. The first and the third were already in the regulations, but it wasn't clear how a novated prime contract would be treated. But they're just clarifying that if you form a joint venture and that joint venture is novated contract, that starts the 2-year clock. And it also clarifies that, and this is how it has worked in the past, that if you are still eligible, and a joint venture is their eligibility for terms in terms of compliance with the 3 and 2 rule is determined as of the date they submit the bid. So with a proposal, for example, under this new rule, if you submit a proposal prior to the last day of that 2-year period and you win the contract, even if the contract is awarded after the 2-year period, you can still get it. You're still eligible for it. And so the same would apply to innovation. So if you purchase a contract and then you submit a novation package, and the novation package goes in before the 2-year period clock ends, so to speak, and it takes 6 months, because it easily can take 6 months for novation to get approved. even if that's the case, you're still going to get be able to get the contract. So all joint ventures are generally unpopulated, which means that they have no direct labor employees. All of the work flows through the joint venture to the individual JV partners who technically act as subcontractors to the joint venture. But you can have an unpopulated joint venture so long as it's populated with just administrative personnel. I mean, there's no direct labor, but there's administrative personnel. And so what they're clarifying here is that you can also have a facility, an FSO, in the joint venture in order for the joint venture to get a facility clearance, which is something that companies have been doing in the past. Again, this is more of a clarification, but they also went a step further and said, well, why should the joint venture itself have to get a facility clearance if one or both of the JV partners has a facility clearance? And so what the final rule says is that if there's a situation where the partner venturer, meaning the minority owner, can get a joint venture or can get the clearance and qualify the JV, and there's another situation where the managing venturer has to have the clearance for the JV to get a clearance. So if the primary and vital requirements of the contract encompass that security portion of the contract that requires the FCL, then the managing venturer, meaning the 51% owner qualifying JV partner, they have to have the clearance. But if the principal purpose of the procurement is not the security portion, meaning the security portion is ancillary to the principal purpose, then the joint venture can rely on the partner venturer's facility clearance to qualify the JV. So this gets into accounting for joint venture receipts. So parties to a joint venture have to count towards their own receipts, their own revenues, their proportionate share of the JV revenues. It wasn't entirely clear how that was done or how that should be done. I think in practice, SBA was doing it based on ownership across the board, meaning if you own 51% of the JV, you count 51% of the JV revenue as your revenue. But they've clarified that if it's a revenue-based size standard, then you only have to account for your proportionate share is based on the amount of work that you perform. So if you're JV partner 1 and you perform 40% of the JV work, then you count 40% of the JV revenues as your own revenues. For employee-based size standards, they kept it, not kept it, but they decided not to go with commensurate with work performed, which makes sense. And instead they said it's based on ownership after first subtracting any joint venture employee that's already counted in the employee count of the JV partner. So I think it's more of a clarification than a new rule, but just keep in mind that if you're a revenue-based size standard and you're using your joint venture, the receipts for determining your size status are going to be based on the amount of work that you performed, as compared to an employee-based size standard where it's going to be based on your ownership of the JV. They also revised the rule because the rule used to say that the protege, for example, had to receive at least 51 or had to receive profits from the joint venture commensurate with the work performed, with the work it performed. So if it performed 50% of the work, it was entitled to 50% of the profits. They just went a step further and said that that's basically the general rule, but the parties can agree to give the protege firm a larger share. So in essence, the protege could perform, in theory, the protege could perform 40% of the work, but if the parties agree that we're going to do a 51-49 split across the board, regardless of how work is performed, then they would be entitled to 51% in that context, as opposed to 40%. I guess a separate question on that other slide is, whether a mentor would actually agree to that, but it's something they could agree to if they wanted to. So this goes towards the limitations on subcontracting. So when you have a mentor-protege joint venture, there's a work share split that you have to comply with. And I referenced 40% earlier because it's a 40-60 split, meaning the protege firm has to perform at least 40% of the work performed by the JV, and the mentor can perform no more than 60% of the work performed by the JV. And the JV at the same time has to comply with the limitations on subcontracting. So if it's a services contract, for example, the JV as the prime contractor can subcontract out no more than 50%, which then leaves 50% to be formed by the two JV partners, of which 40%, no less than 40% has to be done by the protege, and no more than 40% has to be done, no more than 60% has to be done by the mentor. But what they clarified was that these rules that are in the general limitations on subcontracting rules also apply to determining compliance with that 60-40 split. So for example, if it's a construction contract and the mentor is purchasing materials, for example, and those materials amount to $1 million, those materials, like they would under any other construction contract for purpose of determining compliance with the limitations on subcontracting, wouldn't count. The cost of those materials wouldn't count to that 60% limitation, which frankly, that is a good thing. I mean, we always thought that this was how it was intended to work, meaning the limitations on subcontracting rules applied to the 60-40 split, at least in determining compliance, but now they've just gone a step further and clarified. Again, like I mentioned, the protege has to do at least 40% of the work, but they cannot get to that 40% by subcontracting to a similarly situated entity. And if you don't know the similarly situated entity rule, this comes into play in determining limitations on subcontracting, and now it's coming into play in determining the 40-60 split. But generally speaking, if it's a small business, if it's, for example, it's a small business set aside, the prime is a small business, the prime is small, and their subcontractor is also small, and they're small for the subcontract that's issued to them, then that subcontractor qualifies as a similarly situated entity. And any work subcontracted to a similarly situated entity counts towards the self-performance requirement. So if you're subcontracting to a similarly situated entity, you can essentially pass through, again, in theory, 100% of the work. But what they're clarifying is, yeah, that's the general rule for similarly situated entities, but they still want to see that the protege in the joint venture mentor-protege context is benefiting from the relationship and from the joint venture. So they don't want to see a situation where the protege is saying, yeah, I got to my 40%, but I got to my 40% by subcontracting 39% to a similar situated entity. So I guess it applies generally, but it doesn't apply in the case of determining the 40% that the protege has to perform.
So now moving into more general small business rules from this final rule. There have been a couple of changes to affiliation size and status rules, aside from those related to the JVs that Peter just stated. The final rule clarifies that size status is determined as of the date of final proposal revisions for negotiated acquisitions and final bids for sealed bidding for purposes of determining compliance with the non-manufacturer rule, the ostensible subcontractor rule, and with SBA's JV agreement requirements that Peter had already mentioned on the last slides. So this just provides a more unified way to figure out whether someone's affiliated, whether they're small, and it just gives us a tidier deadline for figuring out who's compliant and who's not. It also allows the AGCPL, that's the Associate General Counsel for Procurement Law at SBA, to initiate or file size protests on their own at any point, should they feel the need to do so. It clarifies that women-owned small businesses or economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses and service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses may request formal size determinations in connection with applications and continued eligibility for those programs, as opposed to only in connection with, certain procurements. And further, the rule clarifies that the presumption of identity of interest due to economic dependence of 70% or more on another contractor can be rebutted by showing that despite these contractual relations, the small business contractor isn't solely dependent on this other company for one of two reasons. Either one, because this small business concern has only been in business for just a short amount of time and has only a limited number of contracts, or two, because these contractual relationships don't restrict the small business's ability to sell the same type of products or services to some other purchaser. So first of all, what's the identity of interest? Identity of interest is a base of affiliation where SBA will find that two companies are affiliated because their business is so similar and they're so contractually entangled with each other that it's hard to separate them out. And so that SBA will find, okay, these two companies are affiliated. Usually the threshold for that is if small business A gets 70% or more of its annual receipts from other business B, whether small, large, whatever, over here. So it'll be small business A is dependent on business B over here if it receives 70% or more of its receipts from that business. But the rules clarifying here, or allowing here that if this business was just formed, say, a year ago, and they have only a couple of contracts, and those contracts just happen to be with business B over here, that's okay. That's not going to necessarily show that this new business is absolutely dependent on this other business over here. And similarly, if the contractual relationship isn't some sort of exclusive agreement, like if company A is selling widgets, they have to be allowed to sell widgets to everybody. There can't be an exclusive agreement of like company A will only sell widgets to company B and can only sell gadgets to other people. No, it has to be more equal. It can't be an exclusive arrangement like that.
Yeah, and I've never liked this rule. I still don't like it with the clarification, or I guess the way to rebut the presumption of affiliation. I mean, frankly, if you're a small business, if you're any business, you're going to go to where the money is, and if that money just so happens to be with a single contractor, that's where you're going to go to make your business, financially viable and keep it financially viable. So I don't like it. I wish it had gone away. I appreciate this contractual relationships way to rebut. The one being in business for a short period of time or being dormant and then coming back into life, that was already and a way to presume it. It was just in the case law, not the regulation itself. But on the contractual relations, there's a couple of things just to keep in mind. I mean, what they're going to be looking at, first and foremost, is the agreement that you have with this other business, your prime contractor, or whoever you're contracting with. And they're going to look to see, does it contain a non-compete clause? And frequently, we would put a non-compete clause in a subcontract that essentially says, during the term of this subcontract and for a period of 2 years after, you agree not to compete or team with anyone who's basically doing the work that we do. So they're going to be looking at the contract itself to see if there's a non-compete provision or a similar provision. But then this whole idea of what else does contractual relations mean, and this is not spelled out in the regs, it's just information we've gotten from SBA, is that they're also going to look at geographic location and proximity to another similar prime contractor. So for example, if you're selling widgets to a company in Virginia, and the only other company that is buying widgets right now is in the state of Washington, that they would say that it's not specified, may not be specified in your subcontracting agreement, but just given the geography, the distance, we're going to say that you're restricted, and that's not going to be a way to rebut it. I mean, it'd be a different thing if there was a company selling widgets or buying widgets in Virginia and a company buying widgets in, North Carolina. Maybe you'd have a stronger argument, but frankly, I think it probably had to be another company within, close proximity to your business, meaning somewhere else in Virginia.
regarding past performance. For set-asides, agencies have to consider the capabilities, past performance, and experience of first-tier subcontractors, as well as the small business prime. This also extends a little bit more. Agencies are also supposed to consider capabilities of named first-tier subcontractors, particularly when the small business prime can't demonstrate on its own that it has particular past performance in a certain area. So this is meant to make sure that small businesses have a bit of a leg up when they need it, if they don't have, the super well-rounded experience that a particular solicitation might require. They can then rely on more experienced subcontractors to kind of help them out with that.
Yeah, and this is why, at least before this was made a rule, this is why everyone joint ventures, because under the SBA's rules, a procuring agency has to look at the past performance of each JV partner in a situation where the JV itself doesn't have any experience. So you could be teaming as a small business joint venture, and your joint venture partner could be Northrop, and the agency has to look at Northrop's experience when evaluating your proposal. So now they've just kind of taken it a step further and applied it basically in the same way to a typical prime subcontractor relationship. So it'll be interesting to see if this has any sort of impact on joint ventures and people deciding not to do joint ventures because they don't want to for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, it's really just an extension of a rule that already existed for JVs.
Yeah, because previously it was more discretionary for agencies to consider first-tier subcontractor experience. Now it's more mandatory. I've actually come across several situations prior to this rule where the agency was like, yeah, sure, you named this subcontractor in your proposal, but they're not you, so we're not going to count the experience. And there wasn't really anything we could do because the solicitation didn't say that the agency had to consider this first-tier subcontractor's past performance. But now, with this rule change, now they're going to have to consider that performance. And then regarding certification and recertification, the rule now specifically states that a required recertification changes a firm's status for future options and orders. So what that means would be if a small business is required to recertify as to their small business status for a particular procurement, especially like an IDIQ or that's an indefinite delivery, definite quantity contract, or a multiple award contract, something like that. If the small business has to recertify for an order or for some sort of annual recertification, whatever, under that procurement, that recertification can change the firm's status for the whole rest of the contract, the options, the orders, etc., instead of just for the one specific area in which they had to recertify. The rule also clarifies that if one party to a joint venture is acquired or merges with some other company, only that partner and not the non-affected partner must recertify as to their small business size status or their economic status to qualify the joint venture to recertify as a small business. And continuing on that vein, the new rule requires a firm that experiences any merger, sale, acquisition, including agreements in principle between, so an agreement that isn't, it's not that we're purchasing this business now, but we're going to purchase it, and it's going to happen. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. So if you experience something like that between proposal submission and award of the contract, you have to recertify your size status prior to award. This is just so a firm can't kind of push off a merger or acquisition or whatever until after they submitted a proposal and then, merge or be acquired or acquire somebody else. And then not be small at the time of contract award, but they were small at the time of proposal submission. So now you have to recertify in between, just to make sure that whoever receives the award is indeed a small business. And of course, if as a result of the transaction contemplated, the business is not small anymore, and the transaction occurs within 180 days of proposal submission, the concern is ineligible for award. That's, going to the whole, we don't want people to just push off their mergers and acquisitions a little bit in an effort to circumvent these rules. But if, as a result of this transaction, the concern is no longer small, but the transaction occurs more than 180 days after proposal submission, award can still be made to that company. It just won't count as an award to small business. So it's a little bit of nuance. So if the company became other than small or large, 180 days or less after they submitted their proposal, they're just flat out not eligible for award under this small business set aside. But if it was more than 180 days after proposal submission, they can still be eligible for award. It's just not, the agency won't be able to count it toward their small business contracting goals. So, a bit of nuance, but it can be helpful because sometimes, as I'm sure a lot of you know, there is a substantial amount of lag between when you might submit your proposal and when the agency makes an award. I just worked on one where there was almost a 3-year lag in between those two, and it wouldn't be reasonable to expect people to put effectively their entire business on hold in between submitting a proposal and receiving a contract award. So that's kind of where this is coming from, is making sure that this business is still able to receive the award that they put their bid or quote or whatever in for, even if they're not small anymore. Then for multiple award contracts, contracting officers are required to assign the most appropriate NAICS code to each task order under a multiple award contract. So a contracting officer can't issue a task order for, let's call it computer services, under a MAC that is mostly for manufacturing. That's just not going to fly. So in keeping with that, if the NAICS code that the contracting officer wants to use is not included in this underlying MAC, the MAC just can't be used for that NAICS code. The goal here is to ensure compliance with specifically the non-manufacturing rule. And so if the NAICS code corresponding to the principal purpose of the order in question is not contained in the underlying MAC, the contracting officer just can't use the MAC to issue the order. So again, if the principal purpose is for manufacturing, or principal purpose of the MAC is for manufacturing gadgets, then the MAC can't then be used for providing services on airplanes or whatever. And when a NAICS code designation or a size standard in a solicitation is unclear, incomplete, missing, or just flat out prohibited, SBA can clarify, complete, or supply a NAICS code designation or size standard in connection with a formal size determination or size appeal. Previously, it was more of a SBA would look at it and go, hey, agency, you really need to fix that. And the agencies usually would. But now SBA can just be like, no, here's the right NAICS code, apply this, we're good. Okay, and continuing with multiple award contracts, offerors are now required to certify as to size and status at the time they submit their initial offers, including price, for an order under an unrestricted MAC, except for orders or BPAs issued under an FSS contract, or that's a federal supply schedule contract. The exception to this is if certification is required on an unrestricted MAC, such as for a pool of small business awards, then an offeror doesn't need to recertify when it submits its task order proposal. Now, this is because if a small business has a seat on an unrestricted MAC, its small business status wasn't at issue and wasn't required when the MAC was awarded to the small business. But if the agency, if an ordering agency wants to set aside orders against that unrestricted MAC, then suddenly the small business's status as a small business becomes very relevant. So in that case, the small business would have to certify at the time of the order, as opposed to at the time this big unrestricted MAC was awarded, unless of course they only submitted, they were only awarded as part of a set aside pool, at which point, that at that point when they were awarded that MAC as part of this smaller restricted pool, they would have had to be a small business at that time. So then they wouldn't be required to recertify for every single order after that. And then as corollary, the rule requires that where a socioeconomic status, for example, hub zone or service-disabled veteran-owned small business, what have you, is first required at the order level, as opposed to the overarching MAC level, the firms must qualify at the time they submit their order, or they submit their proposal for the order. It also permits size and status protests when the underlying MAC is unrestricted, except for BPAs and orders issued against a federal supply schedule. This is because that same rationale above applies here. The small business's size status or economic status wasn't at issue when the MAC was awarded, or when they issued, or when they submitted their proposal for the MAC, when the MAC is unrestricted. So it's the rule is just allowing protests at the point at which small business status or economic status becomes actually important to the procurement.
So the next few slides are about changes to the 8A program and the 8A program rules. This is a VIP procurement. So I'm going to skip through these, or not skip through these, breeze through these, so we can save some time for questions. I will say though that we have worked with many service disabled veterans who are not minorities and helped getting them into the 8A program. So simply because you're not a minority, if you have some service connected disability that you can tie to discrimination, you can potentially get into the 8A program. So the first one was the prohibition on immediate family members. So the prior rule was very restricted. So if your father participated in the 8A program, the only way for you to get into the 8A program was by demonstrating that there are zero connections in the form of ownership, control, or contractual relationships between the two concerns. Or that the family members were essentially estranged. And we've been able to get companies into the 8A program despite this rule, but they realized, they being the SBA, that it was a little too restrictive. And so now what they said is that you can get in so long as there's no connections between in the form of ownership or control, and the contractual relationships that you have, which you previously couldn't have under the old version of the rule, are at arm's length and commercially reasonable, meaning you're paying what you should be paying for what you're getting. And then if SBA finds later on during the get into the 8A program and they find that one of these connections, ownership or control, comes into play, they have the right to terminate you. Or if the contracts between the two companies aren't at arm's length and commercially reasonable, they can decide to terminate you. Real quickly, they increased the threshold for when you need to get SBA's approval for a change of ownership. It used to be 10%. They bumped it up to 20%, which obviously is a welcome change. And you also don't need to get SBA's approval if at the end of the day, meaning post-closing, the ownership of the disadvantaged individual, the qualifying owner, is actually increasing. SBA, similar to what Anna was talking about with the Mentor-Protégé program, they got rid of the request for consideration process for the 8A program. So it used to be that if you got denied, you either requested reconsideration or you had to wait 12 months. But since they're getting rid of this request reconsideration option, they're also shortening the time that you have to wait. So instead of having to wait 12 months to reapply, it's just 90 days. And then lastly, the bona fide place of business. Essentially, they did two things. They expanded the definition, which is great. It's no longer just, the area serviced by the district office. It's also the metropolitan statistical area or a contiguous county. So that's obviously a welcome change. And then they also, in terms of how you get approved for a bona fide principal place of business, they now say that if you submit your application, your request, and you don't hear back from the SBA in a certain amount of time, you could presume that it was approved, with the caveat that you can't get awarded the contract until SBA does approve it. So I think with that, we'll turn to questions.
No, so thank you, Peter and Anna, for an excellent panel presentation on SBA's final rule. Yeah, we do have a lot of questions out there, so we're going to open the floor for Q&A. If you have a question for Anna or Peter, please put it in the chat box. If we're unable to answer or get all the questions responded to, we will send them to Anna and Peter, and we'll send the answers out to everybody. So let me start off with a question for you folks. Will there be a time limit on the length of the MPA?
Yes, and it's not changing. I mean, the rules previously said, and they currently state that the term is 3 years, and you can have a successive 3-year term with, you basically get 2 shots. You can do 6 years with a total of 6 years with one mentor, and a total of 6 years with another mentor for a total of 12 years. And that was in the old rules, and it hasn't changed.
Great, thank you. Another question is, I am correct in concluding that these changes do not impact rules for other agencies outside of the SBA mentor-protege programs, such as DOD, DOT, who have their own mentor-protege programs?
Well, yes and no. I mean, some of these provisions, for example, what Anna was saying about having to look at the subcontracting experience of a first-tier subcontractor, I mean, that's going to apply across the board. But if the question is the changes to the mentor-protege program, whether they're impacting the DOD's mentor-protege program, the answer is no. I mean, these are specific to SBA's all small mentor-protege program.
Okay. Is the secondary NAICS code in the 3, 4, or 5 character NAICS?
A secondary NAICS code is just a completely different NAICS code. So you could have your primary NAICS code being 238220, and if you had another NAICS code that was 238222, which I don't even know if that exists, that would still count as a secondary NAICS code. It's not like you have to have the first, to distinguish between a primary and a secondary. You don't have to go through this analysis. Well, do the first 4 digits line up or do they not? It can be just any other NAICS code. It doesn't matter whether the numbers have to just be, it's like just one number in the NAICS code has to be different.
Right. What do you suggest in a case where a company lost its ability to obtain a second mentor resulting from application to get into the all small business program, as opposed to having SBA transfer the certification from 8A to all smalls?
I'm not sure that I understand the question, but I can tell you that the process in terms of if you have an 8A joint venture, if you have an 8A mentor-protege relationship through the 8A mentor-protege program, which no longer exists, it's going to get automatically transferred into the all small mentor-protege program. And it's not like they're going to come to you and say, do you want to do it? Based on our discussions with SBA, it's going to be automatic. So whatever is in the 8A mentor-protege program is just going to be shifted over into the all small mentor-protege program.
Mm-hmm. Do joint venture subcontracts count as contract award?
Trying to think I understand the question. If it's a subcontract to a joint venture, the general rule is no, that's not going to count towards the what's now the 2-year limit. Unless it's a situation where the joint venture is acting as a similarly situated entity. So that would be a situation where you have a small business prime who is issuing a subcontract to a small business joint venture. And the joint venture in that situation can essentially do 100% of the work because of the similar situated entity rule. And I don't know if this is why they did it, but my assumption would be that, hey, well, if they're getting essentially, or they have the ability to do 100% of the work of the contract work because they're a similarly situated entity, we're going to view them as one and the same as the prime contractor and treat it like it was a prime contract.
Are there any familiar restrictions for forming a joint venture? For example, can 2 companies, one owned by a father and one owned by a son?
Yeah, I mean, you might run into an affiliation problem. I think you are going to run into an affiliation problem because there's identity of interest, which Anna spoke to before. There's another identity of interest based on familial relationships, and that gets triggered when you have an immediate family member and you're doing business with each other. And entering into a mentor-protégé relationship or doing a joint venture between a company owned by a son and a company owned by a father, to me, that's doing business. So my guess is they would find you to be affiliated, but keep in mind, affiliation is only a problem if it renders you other than small. So in that situation, if it's a $10 million size standard and son's company is $4 million and the father's company is $5 million for a total of $9 million, the joint venture would still qualify as small.
If an 8A company and large company establish a JV, do they share all their certifications and experience? So the JV would be an 8A, small business, woman-owned small business, and have the large business past performance?
Yeah, essentially, yes. I mean, the JV takes on, if you're in a mentor-protégé relationship with a large business mentor, and you do a joint venture, the JV takes on any status, certification, designation that the protege has. So if you are a protege and you're one of the lucky ones who just so happens to be woman-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned, you're in the AA program and you live in a hub zone, then all of those statuses flow directly to the JV, meaning the JV can go after any of those types of contracts so long as the protege is small under this applicable size standard. And at the same time, the agency is still required to look at the past performance of the large business mentor. So that'd be a great situation.
Okay. So we've
and
got
assuming you comply with the JV regulations as well.
So we've got 1 minute left and probably time for one last question here. But as I said, we will get the ones that are unanswered answered and get them out to everybody. If a JV is doing commercial work, can it be populated for the commercial work? This would be a sub-K. For this, would a sub-K be considered commercial?
Yeah, I mean, all of these rules that we're talking about in terms of restrictions with respect to how JVs are formed and the number of contracts that they can be awarded, they only apply in the small business context, small business federal government contracting context. And the issue is if you have a populated joint venture, and you could still have, technically, you could have a populated joint venture, SBA would just say, we don't like populated joint ventures, so we're going to find the 2 JV partners affiliated. But affiliation isn't an issue outside of small business government contracting. So you could certainly have a populated joint venture and use it for commercial business.
Thank you. So I think we're at time. We're actually a minute over, but I want to thank you to our participants for attending the VIP and VBOC webinar, and to the SBA for making this webinar possible. I would like to ask you to take a moment to complete the very short survey that will be sent to you immediately following this program. Your feedback is very important to us. You'll also be receiving an email including the slides and video of today's webinar, as well as Peter and Anna's contact information. Thank you, and we wish you all continued success in 2020 and into the new year. Thank you, Peter and Anna.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. And have a happy holiday.
Thank you.